What'd you say?
Am I being heard?
Well, I've only known you for like a year, and I would say no.
I'll take it.
You didn't have to sit next to him and Seth, okay?
That's true, though. That is a true
Okay.
statement.
So it's up and live now.
Just don't step on his boots.
That's right.
People a few minutes to hop on in. I think we're almost there. All right. So, welcome. So, yesterday, recall, we got started on Node. And remember, Node allows you to run any sort of JavaScript application outside of the browser. Lets you run code outside the browser. We're going to use that to build web applications specifically. You can build those web servers just using Node. That is entirely possible, and there are some people that do that. But as it stands, it's really hard to build web servers quickly and well just using Node by itself. So what we're going to go over today is a tool called NPM, which will allow us to bring in other packages, other pieces of code that other developers have written, and start integrating those into our application, and that will actually make it a lot quicker to write and build our applications by using code that's already been written. So we'll go over how to use that tool, which is going to be NPM, and then we'll also talk about some of those common packages. I'll introduce you to your first kind of set of packages today. Overall, by the end of the semester, we'll probably have 20 plus packages in our projects, just because there's so many useful tools out there and available. So today we're just going to give you an intro to some of those packages that are available. So agenda objectives for today, we want to go over what NPM is, how to use it, some of the common commands that you're going to use when you're working with NPM. All of these commands are things that you can type into the terminal window in VS Code. And then we'll also talk about some common NPM packages. I think I've got 3 or 4 to talk about today. Okay. So the first piece of this, we're just going to go through those slides. When I get to talk about some of the NPM packages that we're going to use, we'll actually come back to VS Code and we'll do an example with that. So what is NPM? NPM is going to be your new best friend. There's so many things out there available, and you can just slot into your project to solve and to implement a lot of common things. Again, by the end of this, we'll probably have 20 plus NPM packages in your project, just because there's so many things available that you can plug in to NPM. plug into your Node applications. So NPM is short for Node Package Manager, because historically it was historically just strictly part of Node, and that's part of why you get it when you download Node. You get the NPM with it. But now it's kind of branched off and it's actually a separate application. You don't necessarily have to use Node and NPM together, and not everybody does. In fact, if you want to use React with your ASP.NET applications, if you're writing C# applications, you still need to download React using NPM. So even if you're using another backend technology, you may find yourself using NPM to download some dependencies, whether it be you can get jQuery that way, you can get Bootstrap that way. There's all sorts of things that are out there and available. Most things nowadays you can actually download as an NPM package. So that being said, NPM is really the most widely used package manager for Node.js applications. There are some other options out there like Yarn, but for the most part, people are going to use NPM, so that's what we want to get you introduced to. NPM is going to allow you to very quickly download, install, and update your project's dependencies. It keeps, not only does it make it quick to download, it also keeps track of what are those dependencies that you're using and what versions are you using. So you can make sure that you're getting those same versions, or at least getting a compatible version. There's also functionality in there to let you know and allow you to update your dependencies when there's a new version out. It still may, depending on the change in the version, you may still have to make some changes to your code in order to facilitate the changes that they've made, but at least makes it easier to download the files rather than having to go out to all the different websites where those things are hosted and download them individually. So the NPM ecosystem is really made of a few separate parts. First of all, there's a website where you can go to and you can browse all of the packages that are available, read their documentation, see how many users there are, see what the current version is, see when you can even show you when the last update to that package has occurred. So you can know things like, hey, well, this package hasn't an update in 4 years. Well, that may tell you that people have moved on and maybe are using something else. And it can also lead you to the GitHub page for each of these projects, so you can see, well, are there outstanding issues? And if you run into something, you can file a bug and say, hey, I found this issue, and possibly get it fixed. So that's the website, and we'll look at that in a minute. There's also the registry. The registry is the actual database that stores all of the packages and all the code that goes with them. So that's what we're going to interact with kind of indirectly. That's where all the data stores. There's a registry that backs both the website and the client. So the tool that we actually interface in the command line that we're going to interface in Visual Studio will be what we call the NPM client. So the NPM client has a bunch of commands that you can run. It's a terminal tool. To do the download, to do the install, to do the update, and it can even let you publish packages if you have like, hey, here's a snippet of code that I potentially want to let other developers to use. So we can do that as well. So let's look at the website first. Okay, so the website for NPM is npmjs.com. Pull that up in the browser. So here, pretty simple. You're going to see that there is a search bar, and you can just search for whatever package you want. So for instance, one of the packages that we'll talk about, actually let me just look for jQuery, because you've already used jQuery a bit. So if I look in here, I can see there's a few different things available. So for instance, I can actually download jQuery from NPM. You'll also see that the jQuery UI is available here as well. So if I go out and look at jQuery, I can see some important pieces of information. So I can see that the current version that's available is 3.5.1, right? So that's the current version. We can see that the last time they published a new version was 4 months ago. So you can see that they're still making changes, still fixing bugs. We can see over here under weekly downloads, you can see, well, how popular is the package? So right now, jQuery is being downloaded about 3.4 million times per week, right? So that tells us that the jQuery is a pretty popular package, right? There's a lot of projects, a lot of applications that are using this package, okay? We can kind of see how big is it, how many files are in there. We can see what the license is, so it's an MIT open source license. We can see other things in here. Issues are generally outstanding bugs. So there's 61 possibly bugs that they haven't resolved. There's 13 pull requests. Those pull requests are requests for, here's some code, some modifications that developers have made, and I'd like to suggest adding this to this package. So there's potentially 13 people that have submitted changes for jQuery, but they haven't been approved yet, is what that's about. And often those are to fix those issues. You can see a link to the homepage. So if we were to follow through jQuery.com, I can find out more about that package if I follow through documentation over there. You can also follow the repository link. And as you can see, we can get to, here's the GitHub repo for jQuery, right? So we can see all the stuff that's going on with that. Okay. So that's kind of your quick info on the right. You can also look up here under a few different tabs, which are helpful. So if I look under dependencies, I can see that it has no dependencies. 0 dependencies. So there's no other projects, there's no other NPM packages that jQuery depends on. It's standalone, right? Most packages that we look at in here will have some dependencies. We'll have some other projects that it requires in order to work. Now, good news is those dependencies are generally installed automatically. So I don't have to go download those dependencies separately. I just say I want to install jQuery and I'll get or I want to install this package, I'll get all the dependencies with it. You can also look over here under dependents, and that will give you a count of how many other projects, how many other packages on NPM are depending or need jQuery to operate. So there's almost 16,000 packages out there that all need jQuery to function. And that's kind of where you can see stuff there. You can see a lot of information here, a lot of metadata there, a lot of metadata here. And that's really helpful if you're looking out for a package and you're not really sure, is this something that's widely used, or is this something that maybe, is being maintained by one developer. So that can give you an idea of if this is this a well-maintained project or not, and does it have a lot of bugs or not? Is it something that you should use in the application or not? So there's also documentation then in here in the middle, which tells you about how to use that dependency. So for instance, here it talks about how do we install it. Well, in order for us to install jQuery, they say here we need to add a script tag, right? So here they're actually pointing us at the CDN. They're not pointing us at the files that we would download. But so that is still, one way to get it is through the CDN. Also, they talk a little bit about setting up with Babel or Webpack. We'll probably talk about Webpack towards the end of the semester, so we'll kind of look at that. But there's general documentation is the point about each of these packages, right? So we've got that, and we've looked at jQuery. Let's look at maybe jQuery UI, because we saw that one pop up as well. So looking at jQuery UI, right, we notice that there's a lot of, maybe difference between maybe jQuery and jQuery UI. Now, Jonathan, you're asking about who hosts this. Originally, this was NPM was mostly just basically a non-for-profit. Up, I think, in the last year or two, and you can see the notice up here. NPM was actually recently acquired by GitHub, so it's now under the GitHub ownership, the same company that owns GitHub, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think is Microsoft. Maybe I think was it Microsoft or Google? I think that owns GitHub. I forget now. But long story short is GitHub is now paying the hosting fees for NPM. The actual developers don't pay to host anything on NPM. It's just freely available. The upside of that is the upside or downside, however you view it, though, that does mean for anything on NPM, there are no private packages on NPM. So everything on NPM is public. It has to be open source to be on the NPM registry. Means that Microsoft owns all that code. That's the benefit that Microsoft gets. It means that they have all that code and they can do with it what they will. And I think that it's really unclear to me why they purchased GitHub and how all those arrangements happened. But it's clear that they have some interest and some stake in that. So comparing jQuery, right? If I compare jQuery next to, if I take jQuery and stick it up next to jQuery UI, or I guess let me back. I think I killed my. Sorry there. Things glitch out, hardware glitch on my end, and the stream cut out, but it should be back now. So looking at these side by side, are there any things that you notice? I sent both of these links in YouTube so you can kind of look at the pages yourself. Are there any big things that you notice between these two packages, or anything that might give you maybe a red flag if you're looking at jQuery UI? Okay, that's one. See, their last update is 4 years ago versus 4 months ago.
4 years ago, last time there was an update, it seems. Mm-hmm. With the UI.
Yeah. So we're seeing that. We're also seeing that there's much fewer people that are
dependencies.
Huh? Mm-hmm. Yeah, not as many dependents. Overall, what you can see is, again, between the 4 years since their last publish, and this idea of how many projects are using it, we can see two things. 4 years, it means they are not really updating it. There's not any new things happening in jQuery UI, and there's unlikely to be more changes. So what I know from that really means that the developers have abandoned jQuery UI. It's there, you can use it, but there's probably not going to be a bug fix to it ever. It just kind of, it's there. So those are things to watch out for when you're looking at dependencies. And yeah, there's a lot of people using jQuery, but there's a lot fewer people using jQuery UI with it. So do keep that in mind. Do pay attention to those kind of things. Any questions on the jQuery website before I move on to the next thing?
Do we ask questions using Discord, or would you rather we ask questions on the YouTube thing?
YouTube thing would be easier. One thing to point out on the website before we leave is there is some documentation available out at docs.npmjs.com. You can get there from the website if you go up here to the top and you click on documentation. That will take you into here, and it'll give you some more explanation of how the individual commands work and such, the CLI documentation. There's a whole lot of command line things available that you can use with NPM. We're only going to go through a handful of these today, mainly the ones that we need to do our work. But there's a lot more available, and if you do run into, you need to find out more about NPM, this is a great place to look and find out more about the CLI. So let's talk about how we can actually use NPM, okay? How we can use the NPM client in Visual Studio. So remember we talked about yesterday, you can verify your NPM install using npm-v. So you can see when this was run, 16.14.4 was the version I got. I think I might be on 16.14.5. But that way you can verify that it is installed and that it's installed, it's globally available, and see which version you actually have. Okay. So the first command we want to go over is npm init. So npm init will allow us to create a package.json file. Okay. Now, what's a package.json file? A package.json file is sort of a manifest for our projects. It's used for a whole lot of things. It might seem like they're all completely unrelated when you start seeing them, but it all kind of makes sense. And it's just kind of a central place to put configuration for all of our tools and for all of our packages. It's also where NPM is going to store all the names and versions of the packages that we've installed. So we'll need to create this file using npm init, and then we can start installing packages, and it'll track everything that we've installed. Okay. So your package.json is going to look a little bit like this. It is a JSON file, short for JavaScript object notation. So what you'll see here on the outer sides, you've got curly braces. Curly braces represent an object. So we've got an object with a bunch of properties, right? So that's what these key value pairs are. So we've got a name property, which is node 1. So that's the name of this project is node 1. The version of it is version 1.0. The description, or the the explanation, the longhand explanation of what this project is here. So this project creates a simple Node.js, etc. You can type in whatever you want as being the description of the project. Main is kind of the idea of that is that it's the first thing that you see. You might, if it's, yeah, you might need to change the quality up. So the main setting there, the main property says which JavaScript file is the one that you want to run to kind of start the application, generally to start the server. So usually that will be server.js. Just note on the quality, if you refresh, it's still going to be set to whatever quality it is. You'll probably want to go into the cog and set it to auto. You should have a few options there between 720 and 360, etc. If you've got it fixed to a particular quality, refreshing will still stay on that same quality. So you may want to go in there and set it to auto before you refresh. So we've got, that's the kind of the entry point, as we might say. That's the first script to run. Then beneath that, we've got a section called scripts. Scripts is actually another object, so you can see the curly braces in here. So this is a series of commands that we can kind of configure and then run at a later point in time. So you can see this one's got two scripts, one named start and one named nodemon, right? So when I hit start, that's shorthand for, if I run the start script, that's short for running node server.js. If I run nodemon, that's equivalent to running nodemon server.js. So we'll want to set up those scripts to make our process easier, and we'll look at how we do that. How do we mess around with these scripts in Visual Studio in a moment. You can also see the author, right? The author is generally going to be your name. Here it's listed as Ranken. If I create a new file, it typically creates the author as Paul Smith. The license is then the open source license that you would be releasing this code with. So ISC, I'm not entirely sure what it stands for. I know that is the default. MIT is another one that a lot of people use, which is a very short license. I typically license my stuff if I'm going to put it out there publicly as Apache 2.0. There's a bunch of different options you can pick for the license, but the default there is going to be ISC. We need to mess around too much with that because we're not pushing things out publicly for other people to download. Okay, so that's kind of your overview of what your package.json might look like. The whole point is it's a manifest that tracks all of the settings and all the configuration for your project. Okay, so we need to have one of those set up before we move on with the next pieces. So let me actually jump back to Visual Studio. I'm going to go through what this looks like, what the npm init command looks like. Okay, so you remember we started this Node 1 project yesterday. I'm going to continue on with that here. And what I'm going to do, I've already got my terminal open. Remember, if you have it dismissed, you can always go view terminal to get back to it. So I'm going to go ahead and run the npm init command here, and we'll see what we get. So npm init. Okay, I'm going to hit enter on that. And now it's going to ask me a bunch of questions. So npm init gives us kind of this wizard to set up our package.json. So it says this utility will walk you through creating a package.json file. It only covers the most common items and tries to guess sensible defaults. So as we go through here, it will suggest a default value, and we can just accept that by hitting enter, or we can type in our own. So the first question it's asking is, what is the package name? And what it'll do is it'll guess that the package name is probably the name of your folder. So right now I'm in the Node 1 folder. It's guessed that the package is Node 1. If I wanted to have that be something else, I could type it in there and hit enter, but I'm going to just accept that default. Okay, since that's correct. Now it's asking me for the version number. Your version numbers typically start at 1.0.0, and that's what it's picked. So we're just going to hit enter on that as well. It's asking me if I want to enter a description. That description is optional, so I'm just going to leave it out. Next, it's asking me for what the entry point is. So here it's guessed, well, maybe it's program2.js, could also be simple.js. So I can change that if I want. I might want to say, well, the entry point is actually server.js, because that file doesn't exist, so it doesn't know to guess that one. Okay. It's not going to ask for a test command. That's the command that I use to run unit tests. Typically, I don't set that up at the beginning. I'll set that up once I have, get to the point where I'm ready to have testing. But for now, we're just going to hit enter on that. Next thing it asks is your Git repository. If this was at the root of one of my Git repo, it would already go ahead and figure this out. But since I haven't, since this is just on my desktop, it doesn't know a Git repo to associate this with. So that's typically something you do want to have in there, is the Git repository. But for our simple example here, I'm just going to leave that blank. Keywords would be anything that keywords you would put in if you were going to push this up onto the NPM repository. Keywords would be things that the user could search for your package by. Again, we're not publishing anything, so we can leave that blank. The author is what it's going to ask me for here, so I'm going to put that author in as Paul Smith and hit enter. If this isn't a Git repo, there's a good likelihood that it'll figure it out based on your Git settings. But since this is not in a Git repo, it hasn't suggested it. Now it's going to ask me for ISC. I might want to change that and make it MIT. Now that I filled out that full questionnaire, you can see here that it's given me a quick rundown of what it's going to be. So it says, about to write blah, blah, blah. Is this okay? It'll give me a preview of it and say, is that what you want to do? So we say, yep, that's what I want. So I'm going to hit enter. Okay. Now that I've done that, right? So we went through the NPM init, we answered all the questions. There's now a package.json file here in my folder. Yeah, actually, that's the MIT, is short for Michigan Institute of Technology, or Massachusetts. Yeah. If you look under open source licenses, there's actually a whole website, opensource.org, which will tell you about those individual licenses. So I can go in here and I can look at the MIT license. And it's very, very, very simple. The MIT license is this. And it basically says, if anything goes wrong, we're not liable. It's a very short, basically 2-3 paragraphs saying that, here's the code as is. If there's any bugs with it, if you put this into a nuclear reactor, it's your own fault to test it. Don't do that. We're not liable for anything that goes wrong if you use our code. That's what MIT is. So MIT, you're just kind of waiving all your rights to say, I don't really own this. You can do whatever you want with it, but don't sue me. That's what MIT is. Apache 2.0 is a little bit more restricted, which is what I usually use. Let me see what RTC is. I have not heard of RTC personally. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that one, and that one doesn't show up. Anyway. Oh, I'm assuming you mean Ranken Technical College. Yeah. Well, we don't have an open source license named after us. So I was going to look at that before I got distracted. So we have our package.json file here. Right now it's just a bare sort of skeleton, but from this point on I can customize it. Of note, you're only going to run the npm init command once. Once you've run it and gotten your basic file, you're going to then go change this all by hand. That's npm commit init command is just to get you started, just to get you the baseline things that you need. So from there on, if you want to update it, you're just going to open the file up and change it. So we have our package.json file. The next thing I can do now that I have that manifest set up is I can then go start installing packages. So installing packages is pretty easy. You just say npm install and then the name of the package. So if I want to install Express, I would say npm install Express. If I want to install jQuery, I'm going to do npm install jQuery, right? That's all you need to know there. There is a shorthand, and you'll see this in some tutorials. You can actually write it as npm I package name, I short for install, but I typically write it out as install the word. So let's say I want to have jQuery and maybe Bootstrap in this project. So let's try to install those. So I'm going to go install jQuery, npm install jQuery. So you can see what's happened. There is a change. There's a few things that happened when I ran the install. Okay, we can see the output says that it installed, where is it? Installed version 3.51, which is the latest, but there's a few changes that have occurred when I did that. So first, in the package.json, you'll notice that it's made a change. So it's automatically gone and added jQuery as a dependency. You see that? It's gone ahead and added jQuery as a dependency. So what this means is that now I know that this application, it needs jQuery 3.51 to run. Okay, and there's a little bit about the hat that basically says 3.51 or newer-ish. You can kind of read up more on that if you want to get into the nitty-gritty, but it really won't matter for things we do in this class. That's me installing jQuery. So jQuery is now listed as a dependency. It's something I need. Okay. Other things that have happened when I did that. It's also gone and added this package lock.json file. This package lock.json also is used to track your dependencies. This is a file that you need to make sure that you check into version control as it kind of as it mentions here, npm notice. We created a lock file and you should commit this. So when we commit our code, make sure that you don't just commit, your files. You need to make sure that you commit your package.json and your package lock.json. We need to upload all those files to Git, so that I can pull those down and actually test and run your applications. Okay. So where package.json is a file that you should go ahead and you should be editing directly manually. Package lock.json is not one you should ever touch yourself directly. The lock file is one that you let the npm command line automatically update because there's some things that it needs to twiddle around behind the scenes. For instance, if two packages need the same dependency, it has to figure out how to negotiate that. So you want to let that kind of do its job. So edit the package.json file. Don't edit the package lock file directly. Let npm deal with that, and then just commit in the changes that it's made. Okay. Third thing that's happened when I installed that package, there's now this folder called node modules. You see that? So node modules specifically, let me change this. I think it's collapsing those folders. How do I get it to not collapse? Because right now it's collapsing these together. So sometimes this is doing this right now. It doesn't always show it this way, but it's because I have one package. So inside node modules, I now have a folder called jQuery, right? So anything that I download with NPM, the files for that is going to go into this node modules folder. Okay. So while we want to check in these two files, the package files, package.json, package lock, you do want to make sure that nothing in node modules, you don't want to ever commit that to version control. Okay. Part of that is that your files in node modules are going to be really big. So if you do upload them, then it's going to mean that all the developers on your team now have a lot of files to download. So you'll make sure you don't upload those. It also means that they have, not only are there a lot of files there, now you have files in version control that aren't owned by you. So now if two developers are changing dependencies around, you can get into some weird cases when you know, maybe if you need to update dependencies or things like that. So you really just, the main thing to know is don't upload node modules. Okay. Now, how might I accomplish that? You know, how might I make sure that node modules doesn't get updated? How do I make sure that that doesn't get uploaded? That's the right answer. So we use a get ignore. You could try to do this with, you could try to do this, you know, being very careful about what you push and what you don't push. You can't, but that will inevitably eventually bite you in the ass, because eventually one of the developers on the team will forget and accidentally push it. So you want to put some guardrails on that to prevent developers from actually pushing it up. You can't actually move it to another folder because it has to be in your project folder. That's not an option. It needs to be in the same place where your code is. So we can't move it to a separate folder, but we can ignore it using a get ignore file. So let's look at your repos real quick. So let me pull up, let's see, really any of your repos. So I'm going to pull up, who's the first on my list? Ben. So if you look in your repo already, so every developer will have their own node modules folder. So if you look in your repo, at the very root, all of your repos, you should see that you already have a get ignore file that I created for you before the semester started. So this get ignore file is what's going to take care of making sure that node modules doesn't get uploaded. So let's open that up. I'm going to open it up in Notepad++. The get ignore, the whole point of this is to say, here are the files and folders that I never want to upload. Okay. It doesn't mean that there are still ways to get around it and still to upload those files. And once you've uploaded it, then they will kind of stay uploaded. But this is a way to prevent them from getting uploaded in the first place. Now, let's say I look through this file. Just looking at the syntax, if you see a hash at the beginning, that means that is a comment. The other ones are patterns for files that we want to ignore. So I'm going to look in here. I'm going to find node underscore modules. And we can see here node modules slash. So it's already in your get ignore to ignore the node modules folder. So what that should mean is typically that's going to happen automatically. It's going to make sure that you don't upload the Node modules folder. And my examples are also set up that same way. So if you're getting example files from me, you're not going to have that Node modules included in the repository. Okay. So that's the way that we're going to deal with that. Is we're going to use Node modules to prevent we're going to use the git ignore to make sure that those files don't get uploaded. That's, again, it's already configured for you and already set up. So let me go ahead and let me install maybe one more dependency. So I'm going to go npm, remember you do npm install. So the best way to create a git ignore from scratch, if you're starting a new repo, new repository on GitHub, it will actually give you some options. And I can go through that real quick here because that's a great question. If I go to github.com and let's say I'm creating a new repository for some project, okay? When I create that, you see that there's a checkbox for the git ignore. Yeah, you don't have to move it. As long as it's at the root, the git ignore at the root of a repository applies to everything in the repository. So when you go in to create a new project on GitHub, you'll check the add git ignore file, and then you'll just pick the template. So for instance, here I looked for Node. So when I create this repo, it will now have a git ignore file that's been specifically configured for Node. That's it. That's usually all you have to do. Start with that, and then you kind of configure it to, I always have to add some additional rules to it. But that's where you start with one from scratch. Does that answer your question, Paul? So that's how you're going to get to that, should you need it. Okay. So I've installed, back to here, I've installed jQuery. I'm now going to install Bootstrap. So I'm going to npm install Bootstrap. Same kind of process. Okay. So now I have both jQuery and Bootstrap installed as dependencies. That doesn't mean that I'm using them yet. That doesn't mean I'm actually using the files that were downloaded yet. But it does mean, let me refresh here. It does mean that they've been downloaded, right? So if I look in Node modules, I now have a folder for Bootstrap. I have a folder for jQuery. So I've actually downloaded all the files that I might normally go out to the website and get. And that makes it easy if I want to, for instance, maybe use a different version of Bootstrap, or I need to know specifically which version I'm using. So if I wanted to just say, well, let's use version 3.0 of Bootstrap, do that. Then I just run npm install with no package name. If I run it with no package name, that says go install all the dependencies here. So I can change that, and now I have Bootstrap 3.0 instead of Bootstrap 4.52. So I can easily change potentially what version of the dependency I'm using just by changing my package.json file. Now, again, if I'm going back to, say, version 3 or from version 3 to version 4, I'm going to have to change a bunch of things because there were a lot of changes between those two versions of Bootstrap. There'll be some changes again with 5.0. But that that way I can easily download the new files. I'll still have to go through and change all my code, but I can easily get the new files that way. Okay, so given that idea that we don't want to upload Node modules, we don't want to upload that to Git. When you download a project, or if you bring it over to another computer, you're going to find that you don't have this Node modules folder, right? So I don't have this Node modules folder. Okay. See that? I just deleted it. And that's okay because I can easily get it back, right? So as long as these dependencies are registered in my package.json, in my manifest, all I have to do to download all the dependencies I need, npm install. No packaging. As long as you do that, you'll get all of the packages that you've installed previously. So what that means is I can say, well, I've got 10 packages that my project depends on. I put all those into my package.json, list them as dependencies, and then I just run npm install, and it's going to download all of those 10 packages or whatever it is and bring them down into Node modules. So if you're transferring between computers, say you're using a desktop at home and a laptop at school, you may need to run that npm install command to pull down all the dependencies that the project needs. Questions so far on npm install? So that's the npm install command. So we looked at where should be deleted. Well, part of it's not so much to save disk space on our end on the developer machine. It's so that we don't put them in version control. Because anything you put in version control, now you have to download from version control. Yeah, your project won't work without them. But it makes it easier to work with if that's not in version control. So given that we've looked at how to install packages, a very next question that you might ask is, well, what if I want to remove that package? What if I don't want to have that package there anymore? Remove a package is pretty easy. You do npm install to install it. You're going to do npm uninstall to remove it. So let's say I decide I don't want Bootstrap anymore. I'm going to say npm uninstall Bootstrap. Okay, and it's gone. So it's going to go ahead and delete it from there. And refresh here, and you can see it's deleted from there, from the Node modules folder as well. Let's say I want to delete jQuery as well, and get back to a clean project. There we go. So we can use npm install to install dependencies. We can use npm uninstall to remove them. There's also two additional flags that we can use when we're installing dependencies. Some dependencies we may want to install globally. So we'll specifically add the -g flag in there, short for global. -g is going to install it into your computer instead of installing it into your project. So when you use the global flag, it doesn't change your package.json, so it doesn't track that your project needs that, but it installs it so it's available on any project that you're working on. So we'll use that specifically when we want to install command line utilities. So those command line utilities we want to be able to use across our whole computer. We don't necessarily need we don't want those installed on a per project basis. So those things we'll install globally versus packages that are actually part of the application that are needed to run the application. Those we'll install normally. We'll install those into the project. And we'll look at what some of those are. There's one tool that we'll look at today that we'll need to install globally because it's a command line tool, not part of our project per se. I can also add the -d flag. Now note that -g needs to be lowercase, -d must be uppercase. -d is the development install flag. And what this does is it says we're installing this package as a development dependency. What this means is we're only using this dependency, we're only using this package while we're building the project. So a developer would need this, but you don't actually need it to run on a production server. So there's some tools like ESLint and other pieces that we need in order to run the application and test it and build it, but we don't need when the application actually goes live. Okay, so if it's something that you need for the application to function, don't add that -d flag. But if it's something you're using for development, we'll do that. And what that does, one of the things that does, in here you saw when I did npm install, it installed it into the dependencies section. If I do npm install maybe -d, and let's install ESLint as a development dependency, it's going to add it into a different section. So here I have my dependencies, which is where I put things like jQuery and Bootstrap. They're actually part of my application, but things that are development dependencies are going to be under this dev dependencies section. So again, these are things that you don't need when the website goes live, when you deploy it. But they are things that you need to use to work on it. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and uninstall that as well. Actually, maybe I'll just leave it in there. So -d I can use to install development dependencies. Looked at uninstall. Another command I can run with npm is the npm run. So I'm going to put npm run and then the name of a script. Okay, and that's going to run that specific script. So for instance, let's say in here, I want to define a script in my package.json. So we saw there's a script section, but we haven't defined any scripts there. So I'm going to find a script called start, okay, which is the one that, basically if you want to start the application, you call start. And in there, I want to tell it what command to run, right? So if I want to start up simple.js, normally on the command line, I'm going to type in node simple.js. And I could type that anytime I want to run that. Same way I could type node program2.js. So if I want to be able to start that up quickly, maybe I'll just do simple here. So I want to start up simple. I could create that as node simple.js. Okay, and maybe I create another one for program 2. So I want to run program 2. That's equivalent to running program 2.js. So I can define these scripts to make it quicker to run things when I want to. Okay, so there's two ways I can invoke this script. One way I can run that script is I can type in an npm run, and then the name of the script, so npm run simple. So you can see that I run my node simple.js, or I could run npm run program2. And that may not look like it saved me a bunch of npm run program2, not .js. So that will let me start up my server there. And that may not seem like it's saving you a bunch of keystrokes, but as these commands get longer, it saves you from having to type it out every time. It also means that any developer that then comes on to the project later, they can just look at these scripts and have an idea of how to start the application, because otherwise that may not be apparent which command they have to run. Okay, so you can run those commands, npm run, and then the name of the script. There's also here built into Visual Studio, you see I've got this section labeled npm scripts. If I want to start a script, I can actually just directly start it from here. So I can go into, let's say maybe I want to start my simple script. I can just click execute here, and there, it's run my simple script. Or if I want to start up the program2 web server, I can go in here and click run on that. Okay, so once you've entered it into your manifest here in your package.json file, as you know, scripts that are available, they're now available to easily run through Visual Studio, through VS Code. So I would definitely advise any commands that you need to actually use your application, I would definitely make sure you add them to your package.json so that you can, again, run them quickly later. So we talked about some of those NPM commands that you need to know. Let's talk about some of the NPM packages that you'll want to use for the labs, to do some basic things. So these are, I think there's 3 packages here that I want to introduce you to that are going to be really important for any project that you build this semester. So the first one is NodeMon. Remember that we talked about yesterday, anytime you make a change to a file, I have to stop the server and restart it for the new things to be there. So what NodeMon does, it's a tool for development. We don't use this in production. We just use this locally for development. It will automatically restart the server when you make a change. So this is not a production dependency that we want to deploy. It's just a command line tool. But it's a wrapper effectively around the node runtime. So rather than saying node server.js, if I wanted to run my server.js, I would say nodemon server.js. Now to get this command, because you can see it's the first word there, to get nodemon, I need to actually install this globally. I need to install it globally so it's available as a command line tool. So remember we talked about the -G flag is to install something globally. So let's do that now. If you would, go open up VS Code. It doesn't have to be specifically to this Node 1 project. It can be really anywhere. I kill my terminals here. So, and clear that out. So what I want to do is install NodeMon so that it will be available for all of your packages. Yeah, so you remember you were using live server when we were doing static stuff. We're not going to be using live server from here on out. We'll be using, because we'll be building backends, and we're going to be using NodeMon instead of that live server plugin for VS Code. So it's basically going to do the same kind of stuff that live server did for us, but for our backend code, where it automatically restarts it. So in order to install NodeMon, you want to type in npm install -g NodeMon. please go ahead and run that command now. So there's the command, and there's the output that I got. If you would post something into the YouTube chat once you've got NodeMon installed. So now that I have NodeMon installed, I'm going to go update my scripts. So rather than running it as Node simple.js, I'm going to have these start with NodeMon. Now that's all I need to change the scripts. I just need to change them from Node to NodeMon. Okay. So now when I run these applications, so let's say I start up program 2. Okay. We can look and see what program 2 is doing. Remember, if I've got these different paths, so if I go to the root, I get to hello world. If I go to /test, I'm going to get test passed, and if I do anything else, I'm going to get not found. So let me open that up in the browser and see what the server looks like right now. I'm going to go visit localhost 3000. Okay, so right now it says hello world. So let's say I want to make a change to my file, and here I'm going to make a really simple change. I'm just going to change the home page to be hello universe. Okay, so I haven't saved this yet. You can see the white circle on the file. As soon as I save this file, you'll see some messages scrolling down here in my terminal. Okay, so I'm going to hit save, and now we see restarting due to changes. So it's detected that I've made a change to my server code and gone ahead and restarted the server. Okay, so it's gone ahead and restarted the server. Note that that hasn't updated the browser. It's just restarted the server. So I don't have to do a Control-C and then run the server again. I still need to go back to the browser and actually hit refresh. So now it says hello universe. So it saves you that step of having to constantly stop and restart the server. It doesn't save you from potentially needing to refresh the browser. So that way I can just save changes here, refresh the browser, and see the new output. Okay. So that's what NodeMon's going to do for us. And I definitely would advise that you do all of your applications, that you run them locally using NodeMon, because that's going to make it a lot easier to work with, a lot less there to work with. That being said, we'll want to make sure that we don't run NodeMon when we actually push these things live. So when we push these things live, for instance, we'll need to have another command, which specifically is reserved as start. So that start command needs to run without NodeMon. So for instance, we might have here node program to .js. That's because this is the command it's going to run. It's going to run if we deploy this application to the internet. So we can use NodeMon locally for testing, but then we'll want to use we'll want to remove NodeMon for when we deploy it. Okay, and you will notice, as I mentioned previously, when you install things globally, note that there's no reference to NodeMon in my dependencies. Neither my dependencies or my dev dependencies say that I'm using NodeMon. So that's something you have to know to install ahead of time. Okay, so that's NodeMon. Let's look next at another dependency. This one is called .env. What it'll allow us to do is have these .env files, which will make it easier to work with environment variables. So you remember that yesterday I kind of went through how to change the environment variables in Windows, and anytime I do that, I may have to potentially restart Visual Studio, or I may even have to restart my operating system if I go do that. Putting those things actually in environment variables is great for when you push things to production. That's how you want it to be. But it's not really convenient when you're trying to develop your applications locally. Okay. So rather than jumping back and forth between the environment variable settings and rebooting your computer, rebooting Visual Studio, we're going to use this dependency .env to allow us to configure it through a text file instead. So let's say I want to set that up. Okay. So I'm going to stop my server here. I'm back here. So let's install that .env dependency. So I'm going to do npm install .env. Okay. And you'll see it's now a part of one of my dependencies. Typically, I want that as a dependency and not a dev dependency, even though we're using it as, even though we're using that primarily for development. We're typically not going to use it in production. I do generally install it as an actual dependency. Okay, so .env is installed. But so far nothing will have really changed. I've just installed it, right? So I've got to do a little bit of tweaking to get to actually utilize it. So first, let's create a folder, so a new file, and we're going to call this .env.js, .env example. .js. Okay, And so what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to do things like set my port. Actually, I don't need to create this as a separate file. I'm going to just use my program2.js. So let me backtrack, delete .env. I might as well just link this into program2. So you'll remember yesterday that we set up this environment variable here, process env port. We told it to use that. So what I want to be able to do is set that using this .env file. So I'm going to create a new file here, .env. Into that .env file, I'll put some settings that I want to change. So for instance here, I want to set the port. Let's say we change the port to port 5000. Okay, so I'm going to save that. So that's my .env file. My .env file says that the port is 5000. Okay. Now, if that's all I do, it won't actually be incorporated yet. This file is not being listened yet, not being used yet because I haven't told it to use that. So there's two ways to set up the setup.env. I'm going to go out to the NPM website. We can look at the documentation. So NPM JS. I'm going to go look at the .env package. So one way I can set this up is by just requiring it and then calling configure. Okay, so if I say require.env and then config, that's going to then load this .env file. So one way I can set that up is I can put as the first line in my script, I say require.env config. Okay, that's going to now load that env file that we configured here. So when we start the application now, you'll see that it's starting on port 5000 instead of starting on port 3000. So I'm going to say, let's start this application up. Node-mon program 2.js. Okay, and you can see that the server has started up on port 5000. Remember, we've got node-mon here, so well, what if I just change this to 5000 and hit save? Well, one thing with node-mon, it doesn't actually monitor all your files. It just monitors some of them. There's a kind of a filter built in there, and you can actually see here it's only monitoring your JS, your MJS, and your JSON files. So if I want to actually restart, I need to actually resave my JavaScript here. So now it's on port 5001. Okay, so I can use this .env package again to very quickly mess around with the environment variables for testing purposes. Now, it's worth noting that when I bring this .env package in, this needs to be up like the first thing I do, because up until that point, if I try to access the environment variable before that happens, right? So let's say I try to access the port environment variable before this runs, we'll see that our port is still 3000, right? So you need to make sure that that's the first thing that happens. And for some applications, that's fine. For some applications, just putting that up at the top of your file, that's all you need to do. However, sometimes I don't want to go make .env. Maybe I don't want to make .env part of my actual program. Sometimes I want it to be run, and I only want to use it for development, right? Because this forces me to have .env in production as well. Okay, so there's another way that you can set up .env. If you look through the documentation, so this is the first way that they tell you to set up the usage. So put this line at the top of your code, and then put name, value, yada yada in your .env. If I look down further, it's kind of like all the way at the end here. How do I use, oh, no, not there. Where is that command? Q. Ah, there it is, preload. So the other way that you can do this without changing your code, instead of putting this line require.env, you can actually do this through the command line. So they show this example with Node, right? But this also works with Node Mon. So I can actually say add this flag, -r is short for require, and I want to say .env/config, which you can kind of see is what's happening there. So if I say -r.env config, let's put that into our scripts. So if I put it into the script instead, actually I guess I don't need that on simple.js. If I add this into my program2 script, right, now I don't have to modify that. Now it's worth noting that it's still on port 3000. I do actually, anytime I change a script, I do need to actually still restart it. So I do need to kill this server and start it back up. Oh, but I never actually ran it with the script, so I need to run it with the script here. Okay, so now you can see that's the other way to install it. I'll go back to port, it's fine. So it's running on port 5001 instead of running port 3001 because I've added that switch into my command line. So that's the other reason why you may want to, one of the other reasons why you may want to set up a script is so that you can have switches and things like this already pre-configured, and I don't have to type out this entire command every time I want to start my program. I just say npm run program2 or just click run down here. So that's what .env will do. .env will make it easier for us to set up these environment variables without messing with Windows. Okay. So the next package we want to look at is there's another one. There's one called debug. Debug provides improved logging functionality over just using console.log. It allows us to create filters so we can kind of separate our logging messages and have different parts of our application kind of writing to different channels. And it's also going to make the logging look a little bit prettier. And then the third thing that so it splits up the channels, it makes it look a little bit prettier. It also actually makes it really easy for you to disable logging in production as well. Because if I just use console log or console error, those will still be logged in production, and it takes time to do that logging, which can slow down your server. So by having the debug package here instead, that means we can easily turn it off in production. So let me go back and let's install this debug package. So I'm going to stop my server. And I'm going to go npm install. We're going to install debug. Okay. So I've got .env and debug installed. Okay, and then we're going to go use it. Oftentimes, before you go use a package, you probably want to go look at its documentation on the NPM website. So we'll go up here and we'll look at debug real quick. You'll see what it looks like. We'll see these separate channels. So for instance, we can see that there's like an HTTP channel that they've set here, a worker A channel, a worker B channel, and they're all different kind of grouped together and color coded. So we have purple for HTTP, this kind of pink for worker A, orange for worker B, etc., as well as some timestamps and things like that. So we need to install it, but then we also need to add some code to our program to use it. Okay. So remember, when you want to bring in a package, you're going to use this require statement. So I want to put it into a const variable, and we're going to put in here debug. So for most packages, it's going to look like this. I want to require the debug package. Okay. And you'll notice it kind of looks, if you're just looking at this, you'll see, okay, so I can bring in packages like HTTP. They're actually just part of Node, but I can also bring in any package that's a node that I brought in as part of NPM, as just like I would do with the others, with any built-in package. Okay. So one thing special for debug, this is normally how you're going to bring in a package, but different packages, have different setup instructions, so you want to look at that that documentation on NPM, on the NPM website. So here they're putting in a var, definitely put it in a const, but they're passing in an additional argument here to after that require, and that's the name of the channel that we're writing to. So we import the package, but then they're immediately calling it as a method, as a function, to specify what channel we want. So here, typical convention is you're going to start it with app : to say anything that's part of my application is under app, and then underneath there I kind of break it up into different parts of my application. So I might say that this is my entry point, so I might say this is my app startup, right? So I'm going to log anything here related to starting the app. I'm going to log that to app startup. Okay, so I've added that. I'm going to then go down to here. Rather than writing console log, I'm going to change that to debug. That's it. Same thing here, console log. Instead of writing console log, I'm writing debug. Okay, so that I'm logging with debug instead of console log. Let's also change this one to debug. All right, so those have all been switched. So debug, debug, debug. And again, the channel I'm writing to is app startup. Okay, start server back up again. Right, so now you can see when the program runs, you can see what it lists, what channel it's coming out as. Now, when you do this switch right now, just switching into having it logged that way, you're probably not going to see any commands. Okay, you're probably going to see something like this. It'll start up and there won't be any logs. Okay, so in order to actually see the logs, you actually need to turn channels on, because by default there are no channels turned on. My channels are turned on because I have an environment variable that's already configured. So what you'll want to do is go back to this env file and say debug is equal to app : star. So that's going to make anything that is that starts with app : anything that starts with app : is going to be then, you're going to be able to see it. So right now I have everything going out as app startup. In fact, if I go out to like refresh the page, oh, I need to go, I'm on port 5001, so I need to put in 5001 in the address bar. Okay, so those are all being sped out as app startup. I might want to lay this out and have different parts of this go to different channels. So I might split this up, and I might say, well, let's make 2 instances of debug. We might say, well, let's have the debug startup, and I might have debug request. So here I have, that's the startup channel, and this is the request channel. So any request that you make will go to this debug request. So I'm going to change that. Debug request. Down here we'll have debug startup. So these two lines will be logged to the startup channel, and the other one will be logged to the request channel. So let's save that, run the application again. Okay, so I can see these are still logged to startup. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the browser here. So you can see that those are now coming in as a separate channel. So that can make working with and debugging your application a lot easier to kind of be able to break out different parts of your application into separate streams. So general good practice is use that debug package over using console log directly, because eventually you'll need to yank out the console logs when you want to go push this to production, when you want to deploy it. Okay. Any questions on those 3 packages? I think that's the end of my slides. We talked about debug. Oh, we'll talk briefly about Express. We talked about debug, .env, and NodeMon. Are there any questions about those 3 packages? I'll take that as a no. So that's our intro to kind of those projects. So I want to very quickly get you kind of started with something called Express, which is another package that's out there and will make building web servers a whole lot easier. So just like we've installed the other packages before, it'll be npm install express. But to build this, I'm actually going to create this as a separate server. So I'm going to kind of start from start over with a new file. Pull this off to the side. So I've got my code that I need. Okay. So we saw how we wrote this yesterday and how the things we've kind of tacked onto it. I'm going to start a new file. I'm going to call this program3.js. So new file, program3.js. So what we want to go over now is a package called Express. It's a very lightweight, fast, and very minimal package that will make building all of our web servers a whole lot easier. So we can write things like this with all of these ifs and elses and looking at the request. But Express gives us a quicker way to build these applications and deal with the routing. So I need to stop my server here because I need to install NPM. So I'm going to do install Express. So install Express. Okay. So now I need to use Express. Again, anytime, one of the things to remember, anytime we bring in a new package, you can always find more documentation about that by looking at it on the on the NPM homepage. So if we go look here, we can see, hey, how do I need to set up Express? And in fact, right first thing, they give us a hint as to what I need to do to start an Express server. Okay, so I'm actually going to bring this code in, and then we'll go over the different lines and how this works. Okay. So here I have kind of a simple server. We'll need to go back and put some things back in that we talked about previously. So I start by requiring the Express package, and I do that instead of requiring the HTTP package. I next need to create an application, right? So I take this Express package that I brought in, I use parentheses here, basically calls the constructor. So I'm constructing an Express app. That's what this line is doing. And then I register a route. So what I'm saying is apt get. Get says I want to accept get requests on the route here. So I'm going to say when the user requests the root route, then do this. Then send back hello world. Okay. And then just like I did previously, to actually start the server, I want to do listen. So I'm telling it to listen on port 3000. So the server will start up and be listening on port 3000 for open connections. Okay. Now, let's say I want to go run this server. So nodemon program3.js. Okay. So my server is started. You won't see any logs in there right now. Let's go out and test it. So I'm going to go to localhost port 3000. Right? So you can see this hello world is coming up. Okay. Any questions on the code so far? Right. So when I say require Express, I'm bringing in what we would refer to as the Express module. So I was bringing in the HTTP module previously. Now I'm bringing in the Express module, which is that library, that NPM package. Okay. Now, let's say I want to clean this up a little bit. Maybe I want to, yep, I do .env as well. Maybe I want to clean this up a bit, change it to arrow functions. I can do that. So we can say when there is a request to the dot, we'll write that as an arrow function. I might also want to log something when the server starts up. So I might say when the server starts up, let's write console log. And we're going to write out server started. Okay, so now when the server starts, it will actually log something so that we can see that it's actually going. So there's still my kind of basic server setup. If I want to add additional routes right now, so I only got the root route. If I go to another path like /test, we'll see that a get this response cannot get /test. So it's returning that anytime it doesn't have a path for that. So maybe I want to implement that test path. I can add paths pretty easily with Express using that same kind of syntax. So I might say when you go there, I might say, well, let's return test passed. Okay. So I can go to the test route and I'll get test passed. I can go to the root, the home page, and I'll get hello world. But if I go somewhere else, I'm going to find that it can't find that. It's going to say, I can't find that path. Okay, so that's all fine and good. So I can make it do whatever I want there. It's worth mentioning this is a get route. So if I wanted to create a post route, I can use the word post there to start handling some form submissions. Okay, so that's kind of our start, right? What might I want to add to this? Remember what I had in program 2, right? So we've installed some of these dependencies, and we did a few things in terms of setup. Well, I probably want that port, for instance, to be configurable, right? So up at the top, rather than just hard coding in, or I could put it down here, rather than hard coding port 3000. I might say const port is equal to process.env.port or 3000. So I want to say if there's an environment variable to set the port, we'll run on that port. I might also want to update my logging message here to say the port number that it's running on, because right now it's not doing that. So here it'll say we're running on port 3000 instead of just saying hey, it's starting. Okay, so I can make those changes. I also probably want to bring in the debug package as well. So let's bring that in. Const debug equals require. And I'm going to say require debug. This might be app startup. So rather than logging the console log, I might say log it here. I might also log something along this path to say, you know, test requested, and maybe home page requested, or maybe this is test page, home page. So I can see in my logs when those things are happening. So here I've switched over to debug now. So we have servers listening on port 3000. And if I switch it, if I go here and see home page, go to /test, and log it as test page. Now, we haven't talked about it yet, but there is an easy way for it to, there's another package we can bring in to make it easily just log all of the paths that are requested. So that's not something we normally have to add to each of these requests, each of these handlers. Okay. Now, remember, in order for it to use .env, I still wanted to add in either to the top of the page, top of the file, this command, or I need to add it into my script. If I add it in here, we'll see that it's now on port 5001. So I refresh it over here. It'll say, hey, I can't find it anymore because it's not running on port 3000. So let's go over to port 5001. So there's kind of your starting point for an Express server with debug in there as well as .env. And we've also got Nodebound running as well. I think we're overdue for a break, so let's go ahead and take a break and come back at 3:20, and then we'll finish up here.
Mr. Smith.
Yes. Okay, we're sitting at 320. Let me give it a little bit. It's 321. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so far what we've built is this sort of skeleton of a server. And Darnell, you asked a question of like, well, okay, so I have this server, and I'm sending back some text. You know, what if I actually want to send out back some HTML, right? Well, what I'm doing right now, I'm sending just a string back to the browser. That's all I'm sending back to the browser. But if we look at how the browser is interpreting it, it actually is interpreting it as HTML. So if I were to say, for instance, put an H1 tag around this response that we're sending back, and go look at the home page, I'll already see, hey, something changed, right? So that H1 is actually being represented. So I could actually just send back my text here as a string. I send back my HTML, right? I could just send it back this way. What's the problem with setting it up this way, though? If I want to say, let's write all of our HTML into our JavaScript like this. It's going to be pretty bloated, right? It's going to mean that I have a lot of code now in my JavaScript. It's also going to mean that I can't use all my existing tooling for working with HTML and CSS and JavaScript files, etc. Yeah, so we're not going to do that. So what we're going to do instead is we will actually break it out. We'll make an HTML file, and we're going to ship that back. We're going to send that whole HTML file back to the client. So in here, in my folder, in my project, I'm going to create a new folder. Okay, and I'm going to call this public. Okay, so it doesn't have to be named public, but public's a common convention. So public, anything we put in public is stuff what we're going to say, this is stuff we just want to serve to the client as static content. Anybody can get it. Anybody that comes to our website, there's no sort of security restriction on anything in public. It's just files we're going to send directly as is. Okay. Now remember, usually we call our homepage index.html. So inside of public, I'm going to create an index.html file. Let's go ahead and put in exclamation point tab so I can get here, homepage, and maybe I give this a quick header, H1, my first HTML page, and maybe some quick content. Okay. So if you're with me here, I've created an index.html, just some quick content in it, put some quick content in it, and it's in this public folder, right? So if I go to visit the homepage right now, we're still seeing this hello world. We're not seeing this response. I need to go into my program and actually tell it to send this file to the client. So rather than writing the HTML here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say send file, and I'm going to then give it the path to the file that we want to send back to the client. So here, remember, this is in the public folder. So I'm going to say send file public / index.html. Okay, I'm going to save that. It's going to restart the server. Oh, something's not quite right. We're close, right? So I said, let's send back this relative path, public index.html. But when I try to then run it in the browser, I'm getting an error saying this path needs to be an absolute path. So for send file to work, it needs to be an absolute path to the folder. Okay, it can't be a relative path. It has to be an absolute path. Okay, so in order to make it an absolute path, I need to know where is this public folder. Where is the root, right? Well, I can access that reaching back into Node. I can access the current directory using a special global variable underscore underscore dir name. Underscore underscore dir name is the folder that my JavaScript file is in, right? So we're running from program3.js. That means this is dir name. So I could say add that. I do need to add, I think let me see, I think I do need to add a slash in there. Yep. Because if I don't add a slash in there, then it's looking for node1 public index.html. See, there's no slash separating those two folders. So I need to make sure I put a slash in there for that. Okay, and then I get this. Now, oftentimes when you're combining paths, you can combine them with, actually, you can combine them with plus like this. It's not necessarily the best way, and we'll look at that in a minute, what a better option is. But you can now see, right, the page that I created, the index, the home page, right, is now being served. Right? The content we put into index.html is now being served as the home page. So simply by using send file instead of using send, I can actually send an entire file back to the browser. Okay. Now, when you're putting paths together, you can do concatenation like this, but as you saw, I have to then remember things like I have to remember to put a slash there, right? And that only it's that way because, well, dir name doesn't end with a slash. If dir name ended with a slash, well, then I don't need a slash. So we can do concatenation, but that can easily get us into weird errors like this where the path is wrong because one of the two things needed a slash. So rather than doing concatenation to put together different parts of the path, I would recommend you use a package that's part of Node itself. So, and it's called the path package. The path has a lot of different functions that we can use when we're working with both relative and absolute paths. So we're going to bring in require path. Okay, so I'm going to bring in the path package, and I'm going to use it down here to combine these two things. So path has a method called join. Join takes several parts of a path and concatenates them together, but it uses appropriate rules for paths, like checking, is there a slash at the beginning and end of things to make that work. So rather than saying dir name plus public index HTML, I'm going to use the path package to combine those two things. So I'm going to say path.join instead of just concatenating. Okay, so that will deal with that either way. So if I don't have a slash there, and then I believe, yeah, so I can have the slash there or not have the slash there, and it actually works both ways now instead of only working one way or the other. So that can avoid a lot of common issues if you just use path.join instead of trying to concatenate two different paths. Okay. So that's that. Let's say I want to have my test. Maybe I want to have my test also be a file. Maybe I want to have that, be test.html, right? So I could write it that way. If I try to go visit it now, however, right? So I haven't created the test file yet. It's going to say, hey, I can't find it, right? So I'm going to go back to having that just say send test. Okay, so that's all I need to do to send static files back. Now let's say I want to have it serve up a favicon or such. Well, how would I get it to do that? Well, remember that we have these paths that we're specifying here. So for instance, if I wanted to specify the favicon path, I might say, let's refer to that favicon.ico, and we'll tell it what to send back. So I'm probably going to put that favicon again in the public folder because I want to serve up anything that's kind of static content, static files as that. So I might say that points to favicon.ico. Okay. Now I do actually need a favicon file because right now there isn't one there. If I try to go to favicon.ico, I'll see that there's no file available, right? So I need to create that file. I'm going to go grab a favicon that I already have made and drop that in. So unit 1 examples node public. Oh, maybe I don't have one in that folder. I know I have one somewhere here. There's a favicon. Okay, so I've got a old bootstrap favicon in my public folder. Let's do a F5 here. We can now see it's being pulled down. And let me do a control 5 to bring that down. Okay, so I can serve up any file one by one by saying here's the path, right? And then here's how to serve it. Okay. So Troy, you were asking about how would I serve up jQuery and Bootstrap? How would I serve up those files? I think that's a little bit more tricky. So you can, but it's not as simple as that. Because think about where this is, right? So if I put in a path into my index.html, that's from the front end. It's not from the back end. So because I positioned my files in public, right? Node modules is actually outside of my public folder. The browser can't get to any files in Node in Node modules. And that's actually good. I don't want the browser to be able to just get any files in Node modules because that would be a major security problem. If my client could just get anything in Node modules. So I'm going to keep that outside. And what I want to only expose some files to be used through there. Okay. So we'll come back to that in a minute, and we'll talk about what I might need to do to actually be able to serve jQuery and Bootstrap. And I think I might actually have to answer that tomorrow, just with where our timing is at. So anything in public I can serve right now as is, creating a path for each one of these. So let's say I want to add some CSS, and right now I'm going to not go straight up to Bootstrap. I'm just going to add my custom CSS file. So I'm going to say let's create a CSS folder, and we'll put inside there, we'll have a new file that'll be main.css. So what we're seeing kind of inside of our public is all the normal static stuff that we would do. Okay. So in here, I'm going to change the font for the page. Font family. Okay. And I'm going to change it to Arial. Okay, so we're going to change the font to Arial. We should see that here. Okay, now remember, when I add in that external CSS, I still need to link it up. So link rel style sheet href is CSS / main CSS. Okay, so I've got a link to that style sheet there. Now, I would expect, once I refresh this, I would expect to be able to get to my CSS file, my external CSS file that I just referred to. But as you can see, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. So I've created the CSS file. I've got a link that refers to it. But as far as I can tell, it's not doing anything, right? So if I look in the browser and I hit F12, go to the console, you'll see that there's some errors, right? So in here it says refused to apply styles from localhost 5001 CSS main CSS because its MIME type is not supported, right? Saying its MIME type is not supported, we're saying, well, what's happening right now is it's actually returning an HTML file, right? In fact, if I go to open that, you see what's coming back when I try to get to CSS, main CSS? It's saying I cannot get that file. What's the problem? How do I fix that? How do I allow it to get to main CSS? And why is it not able to get there? Correct. So I've got the link all up and ready, but I haven't created what we would call a route. I haven't created a route for that CSS file. Okay. So let's say I go and create another route. Right? So I'm going to create another route, and this route is going to be for the CSS. So I'm going to say CSS / main. When you ask for CSS main.css, we'll send public / main / CSS, right? So then I can go back to the browser, refresh. I can kind of see it happening there. Let's go back to the home page. There we go, right? So I can serve that up, but I got to remember to now add a path for every single route or file that I want to be able to access from the front end. Okay. So that's fine, right? But let's say I have 20 files, right? If I keep going down this route and I have to define a route for every single file, this is going to get pretty big and pretty messy pretty quick, right? even for your very simple pages, that's going to get messy quick. Okay. So what I want to do is say, well, everything in public, I just want to make that accessible to our users. Everything in public, they should be able to get access to. Because I don't want to create a route for every single file there. So let's comment out some of this stuff here. Okay, so I'm going to comment out these 3 routes, the favicon, the test, the main CSS. And I'm going to introduce a new route, effectively, or new set of routes. Okay, so if I say app get, I'm introducing a route for get requests. If I say app post, I'm introducing a route for post requests, on and on and on. Now, there's a special method I can use, which is called app.use, and that will allow me to introduce a group of routes. So I can say I want to bind this set of routes basically to a folder. Okay. Use is technically used for what we will refer to as middleware. It's things that kind of go in between, and usually they do processing, partial processing on your requests, kind of in between. So you may go through a series of middlewares and then actually hit your handler, hit your route. But for now, we're going to hook this. We'll talk more about middleware later. So that's why I'm using use, is because this is technically a middleware. I'm going to say express. I think it's express.static. Okay. So app use. This is where I want to mount it. I'm going to say express static public. So I'm saying everything in the public folder is static content, and I want it to all be accessible at the root. So it's kind of going to treat everything that is in the public folder as kind of now at the root of your website. So that means with just that route in place, hey, my CSS is available, my favicon is available. If I wanted to create another file in here, or I want to refer to, index.html. Okay, so using this express static, using this allows me to serve up an entire folder of static files. Okay, now if I had set this path here, if I had set this as public, then all the paths would be a little bit different, right? So instead of these things being mounted at the root, they would be mounted under public. So if I mount it this way, putting public as the mounting point, then I would have to type in /public /CSS /main.css to get to my actual files. But that's, as it turns out, it's inconvenient to have that extra public in there, and it actually breaks your HTML in general. I want to be able to refer to it just as CSS main CSS, which is why I'm mounting that at the root instead of mounting that at public. Okay. So here we have a server now that serves the index.html file as the home page and serves every other file. Because I'm looking at the CSS file itself. I was looking at the CSS file there. So we'll serve the home page from index.html, and it'll serve everything else in the public folder as its relative path. Paul, if you're not getting some of those things to show up, I would recommend checking that everything's kind of in the right place. So for instance, make sure you're using app use. You've typed in that line exactly the same way. Also make sure that your CSS folder is inside of public. If your CSS, if this is not inside of public, this won't work. So like if I had moved this out here, right? So CSS you can see is not inside of public. That means it can't find it. So anything like that you want to serve as static content, you want to make sure you put it into the public folder. And if that doesn't fix it, I think we'll just have to follow up with both of you after this and see what where you're at. Maybe we can troubleshoot it. Okay. Any questions on serving up static files at this point? I'll check it offline. Okay, just wrapping up with my slides here. So packages we've talked about. We went over how to use NodeMon to automatically restart your server. We talked about how to use .env to easily configure environment variables, and specifically the two that you want to configure is your port for which server that it's listening to, as well as debug, which is going to configure the next package about which channels that you're seeing. Debug we saw is kind of an improvement over console log for writing out log messages. And then finally we talked about starting to build servers using the Express framework. In addition to those packages, we talked about what is NPM, how do we use it. We talked about a few different NPM commands. We went over how to check the version with npm v. We talked about npm init. That's going to create that initial package.json file for your project, which you only need to run that once for the project, and then it'll be set. You can just edit the package.json from there. And then npm install is how you're going to install packages into your project. If you do -g, that installs it globally, so we're going to use those for command line tools like NodeMon. We can do npm install -d for development tools. We haven't hit any of those yet, but we will later. And npm install to uninstall things, or npm run to run some of the scripts that you've configured. Yeah, so everything that that's static I'm putting into this public folder. Node modules is outside of it. So I'm going to have to do something a little bit different I'm going to have to, do a little bit of a trick with what we've covered today to be able to serve up those Bootstrap and jQuery files. So we'll look at that tomorrow, but I think we need to call it for today. All right, so I'm going to sign off on this stream here, and then I'll be over back in Discord.